Hi, everyone. Welcome to Happy to See Me, the podcast that puts the spotlight on the overlooked and underestimated. I'm Erika Casupanan. A lot of people know me as an underestimated winner. And today we are talking about the overlooked parts of personal finance when it comes to women of color and people who grew up in immigrant households. So I am speaking to accredited financial counselor Parween Mander. But before that, I love to start the episode talking about something I was happy to see this week. And okay, but I was really debating whether or not this is what I was going to share, but I thought maybe I'll regret this in a few months. I don't think I really will. But right now, what I'm happy to see is slowing down. It is that terrible time of the year where it is now dark once it hits 5 p.m. But for me, perhaps too optimistic at times. I don't think too optimistic. I think I just like to enjoy life. I'm excited about the opportunity to slow down and spend more time at home and being really intentional about how I spend my time. I love going out. I love to go out. I love to socialize, not necessarily going to the bar and getting wasted every night, but I love going out and I love going out to see my friends. But I'm seeing this as an opportunity to really spend some time in this home that I love so much or do things with friends that are perhaps a bit more chill. So I am spending more time, usually on the weekdays, with ambient lighting, watching movies under the blankets on the couch, having great conversations, and just enjoying a slower pace. Am I going to regret this once it gets to the dark days of winter in a few months? Maybe at that point I'll be like, all right, I'm ready to go. And also, it's not like I'm staying home all the time. At least on the weekends, I am still going out. So I'm still socializing and having a great time. But I'm really trying to take in and be happy to see this moment of slowing down. Everyone I talk to seems to feel like they are burning out as they reach the end of the year. So I'm hopeful that if people have the opportunity to, they can slow down a bit too. And let me know. Let me know if you are slowing down this year. But what I'm happy to see for now, again, maybe in 2 weeks I'll be stir crazy and want to go out. But for now, what I'm happy to see is a bit of a slower pace. And when you slow down, it's always a good time to self-reflect. And I think that it's amazing that I was able to speak to this guest this week because it is time to self-reflect about something that I think is uncomfortable for a lot of people, which is talking about money. So this week, I'm speaking to Parween Mander. Parween is an accredited financial counselor and a certified trauma of money facilitator. So after she almost lost her family home at the age of 16, Parween told herself her goal is to make sure she is financially independent. And then years later, when she turned 28, she had built a net worth for herself of $200,000. Now she is on a mission. She wants to make sure that she's providing honest and relatable feedback to women of color and people from immigrant households. And she wants to empower women of color to be able to grow their own intergenerational wealth. So we talk about how growing up in an immigrant household can help you to develop your money story. And this money story can either bring up positive or negative emotions when it comes to money. And this impacts your ability to be managing your money growing up. So it's really interesting to hear about how everything is so connected to your emotions and the way that you feel. We also talk about how Parween grew up without seeing money mentors who looked like her or seeing people in the finance space who really understood all of the complexities of growing up in an immigrant household and how these gaps can create challenges for women of color and people from immigrant households as they are trying to build their own wealth. And it's important to note this conversation is not limited to people who grew up in immigrant households. I think anybody who grew up perhaps with a money scarcity mindset or who has mixed emotions about the way that they've seen their parents or their caregivers talk about money and how these can potentially create these stories that hold you back as an adult. I think that being able to really reflect on these stories is going to be able to help all of us. Parween will, of course, also give you advice for identifying and addressing your own money story and how we can all take steps today in terms of getting our finances in order and building our own wealth. I heard Parween on a podcast a few years ago, and it really helped me to wrap my head around the management of money and my feelings towards money. And it's my pleasure to now have her on the show today. So let's get into it. This is Parween Mander. I hope you enjoy it. So you've made a living out of finance and in particular empowering women of color and people from immigrant households when it comes to finances. So congratulations. I feel like people don't realize that the way that you grew up impacts your finances too. It's not just the understanding how investments work, understanding that you need to save for retirement, but there's that huge emotional side of it. So can you tell me a little bit about how you grew up and the role that money played in your family?
Yeah, absolutely. So for myself, I'm the oldest daughter in an immigrant household, so I definitely had a lot more responsibility than my siblings. And when it comes to the finance realm, I was just very overly exposed to adult financial matters at a young age. And so the biggest memory or the most impactful memory that I have is that when I was 16, we almost lost our childhood home. And at that time, I was, going with my parents to the banks, and I was like talking with the advisors, and I was translating what they were saying to my parents. So again, I was very heavily involved on the financial realm with my parents. And on top of that, I think what that experience taught me was just if you don't have money, you don't really have power, security, or control. So that must mean if you have money, you have all those things. And that was the association that I started to bring, that okay, like having money equals safety, and not having it, you don't have any safety. And that really defines sort of my own relationship with my finances. Over the next 10 years, I kind of just vowed to myself to become financially independent. And so by age 26, I built a six-figure net worth. And a lot of it had to do with this idea that I was always at the forefront of understanding the role of money, and just not having it meant not having safety. And so it was definitely a trauma response, but it defined my relationship with my finances.
Oh, yeah. A couple weeks ago, I had Vera Chang on the show, who is a psychotherapist who talks a lot about Asian intergenerational trauma. And she taught me the idea of parentification. So, having to be the parent to your parents, and then how that's resulted in people being extra responsible and that being a trauma response and really having to teach themselves a lot of things. So, you built this net worth for yourself 10 years later after you had this moment with your parents. How did you teach yourself finance? Did you learn it in school? Did you have to seek out your own money mentors?
Yeah, so I just self-taught myself. I would watch TV. There's a show, I remember, I think it was on the Slice TV network or something. It was called Till Debt Do Us Part. And it was a
Oh, I
money.
remember that
Do you
show.
remember that?
Yeah.
No one remembers the show, but I loved it. I was like 16, 17. I was watching this show. And this idea of a money coach going to people's houses and like helping them with their finances, I started to kind of pick up on like her techniques and her tips. Like debt is bad, savings is good, those types of things. And then beyond that, throughout my 20s, early 20s, I really relied heavily on just YouTube, blog posts, and just kind of seeking out specifically Canadian finance creators, because on the American side, it can get kind of confusing, especially when it comes to the investing realm. So I was just sort of looking at all mediums of, avenues to teach myself. But as I was doing that, I started to realize that there just weren't any money mentors who looked like me and who were kind of talking about money from the realm of being a daughter of immigrants, and the additional responsibilities that I had. So I always felt this sense of like shame and guilt, because maybe I wasn't saving as much as I should be because I'm helping my parents, right? Or this idea of like planning for my own retirement, but I'm also like, well, what about my parents' retirement? And so a lot of conflicting messages sort of came up for me in those times as well. But for the most part, yes, definitely was self-taught.
It's so interesting. I remember that show, and it's funny because I remember I loved that show Till Death Do Us Part. And often this woman would come into people's houses and give them an envelope with cash, and they're like, "You can only use cash." That was always one of the first things. There's always some type of jar element where you're supposed to put physical cash in a jar at the end of the week. But then I remember also being a little stressed out watching it, because I was like, oh, wow, money needs to be so rigid and money needs to be all these things. And as I look back, I feel like that was probably a trauma response to growing up in an immigrant household as well. So then when it came to you then being self-taught, building your business, did you always know that you wanted to focus on women of color and immigrants, or was that something that you kind of fell into?
Something I fell into, I guess a little bit of backstory, is when I launched my business in April of 2020, I started off as new grad finance. And my original sort of clientele was supposed to be like new grads that just graduated university and helping them financially. And so this is a bit of a business lesson, but I realized that that niche wasn't going to work because new grads, number one, don't necessarily have the financial means to get support, right? They have a lot of things going on at that time frame, and so it just wasn't really lining up with the work that I wanted to do. And so I kind of fell back to like the original idea of like, hey, there were no money mentors that looked like me. What if I focused instead on just my identity, my experience with money, sharing that story, and just kind of seeing if that resonates with other people? And it did. And so I started to really attract and reach other women of color, whether or not they're from immigrant upbringings or not. That just kind of resonated with this idea of having money trauma, of, you know, there being more to a relationship with their finance than just budgeting or debt.
Yeah, that's honestly such a good lesson, I think, for everybody, where just because you haven't seen it before, your experience resonates with you, so it could potentially resonate with somebody else. So
Yes.
I'm happy to see that you have created this space for women of color and immigrant people to talk about money. So I think that the other thing in terms of the work you do, it's not necessarily exclusive to people who are women of color or immigrants in the way that you talk about money, because what I love about your approach to talking about money is showing that there are emotions tied to it, and it's often a trauma response. So if you're somebody who grew up in a paycheck to paycheck household, that is going to affect the way that you interact with money. And it's not, yeah, it goes beyond just learning how much you should be putting into your savings account every week.
For sure. And I think just to kind of piggyback off that, yeah, the clients I work with mainly are women of color, but some are not. And again, it's because they resonate with that idea of, hey, I grew up sort of low income, or my parents were not the best with money. And so I feel really afraid of money, and what you're talking about relates to that. And so it also kind of draws them in.
Mm-hmm. And I saw that your business is called The Wealthy Wolf. And I feel like this relates to the way that you grew up too. So why did you decide that the wolf needs to be the symbol for your business?
Yeah, so I've always sort of had an affiliation with the wolf. I think it represents a duality in terms of its identity. There's like the lone wolf who's very independent and just like, you know, on their own. And then there's sort of like this idea of like the family pack and like being part of a tribe. And so as a daughter of immigrants, I felt that very much tied up my identity, which is, you know, trying to forge my own path and do my own thing and be fiercely independent, but at the same time, still being there for my parents and my family and very much being part of that tribe. But again, sometimes that those identities can conflict, right? Like feeling guilty for wanting to do my own thing, maybe straying from the path my parents wanted, for example. But that's sort of like, yeah, the representation of the wolf. And then the wealthy part, just make us rich.
We all want, yeah, we all want to be rich. And yeah, I think the wolf captures it perfectly. As I speak to some of my friends who are from Asian backgrounds, it's so interesting because it's like implied, like, oh, we know that parents have the expectation that their retirement plan is living with one of their kids in the future or something. And I grew up in a multi-generational household. My grandparents live with me. I don't think my parents are planning to live with me. Luckily, there's 3 other kids in my family, so hopefully they can live with them. But that's culturally something that is part of the Asian culture and that we just consider when it comes to money. Whereas when I talk to my friends from different backgrounds, it's such a foreign idea to them. They cannot wrap their head around how someone might have to be responsible for their parents later. And something that I think is really interesting about how you talk about money is you talk about your money story and how growing up affects the money story you tell yourself. And I think your immigrant background and your culture relates to that. So can you explain what someone's money story is?
Yeah, your money story is basically your lived experiences with money, and it's unique to you. Like your money story is gonna be different from somebody else and different from me, etc. And so what your money story really tells you is whether or not money is safe to engage with. That essentially is your money story. And so if you're someone that grew up in an environment where money was talked about positively, you know, you had everything that you needed, right? You were very secure. You're going to have more of a positive money story than someone who grew up in a different environment where money was scarce. Money wasn't always there for them. It caused conflict. It led to fights, all these things. And so we inherit those beliefs of whether or not money is good or bad. And that can also transform into behavioral things, into adulthood when you get access to your own money, right? So if you associate money with being bad, leads to conflict, you may avoid, right? If you're someone that, again, grew up a little bit more secure and felt a little bit more safe with money, right, you may already be a step ahead of other people and saving, maybe budgeting, and maybe being able to turn towards your finances. So Your money story really lays a blueprint for how you're going to react behaviorally with your money into adulthood.
So, what's an example of a common money story that you see with your clients? And what are some of the habits that they develop as adults as a result?
Yeah, this idea that money is hard to make and hard to keep. So growing up as a kid of immigrants, typically our parents didn't really have salary positions, right? They were working sometimes multiple jobs to make it work. And just seeing that struggle and how hard it was to make that money, and then also that money disappearing, right? Just because your parents were working that hard didn't mean that in some cases that you were financially secure. So that leads to a bit of a disconnect too when you're into adulthood of like, well, if I don't work as hard, then or just a conflicting view on sort of the tie between workaholism and earning and your earning ratio. The next one's definitely going to be around specifically being a daughter of immigrants, which is this idea of in order to be good, that means sharing your wealth with other people. Again, growing up in a multi-generational household. And so what that could look like into adulthood is, your paycheck comes in, but doesn't really feel like it's entirely yours. Right? You're kind of marking in your head of like, well, mom, I need something. Well, I'll help my dad with that. Or my siblings, I don't want them to go through what I went through. So I'm just going to be giving my money away. And so what that can lead to is potentially debt, decreased savings for yourself, and this idea that you're living paycheck to paycheck, even though you're probably making more than your parents ever did. But again, this conflicting idea of like, well, is that money yours or should it be going to other people?
So it sounds like when you're talking to people who have these stories, they need to do internal work to get over, not even get over it, but to identify that these are things that are holding them back and then to rewrite the story for them. And I saw on your bio that you are also a trauma and money program facilitator. So I feel like this all links in together. So, what does a trauma and money program facilitator do, and how can you help people to rewrite their money stories?
Yeah, so the Trauma Money program was started by Chantel Chapman, who is definitely a mentor of mine in this space. And so when I was getting into the idea of coaching other people, I got my designation as an accredited financial counselor, which is sort of the budgeting and the debt side, like that was all taken care of. But I just knew that when it comes to sort of helping people with their finances, there's behaviorally and psychologically a disconnect there. Right? Because for the most part, people know what to do with their money, right? The right thing to do. You budget, you save, you pay off debt. But there's something that keeps blocking people from being able to implement that advice. And so that's where the trauma money approach comes into play, which is getting a deeper understanding psychologically and behaviorally of what goes on with people's nervous system and their response to money. Again, I said the statement earlier, is money safe or is it unsafe for you? If it's unsafe, it's going to trigger your nervous system. And this leads to things like a fight or flight response or a freeze response, which is terms that most of us have heard. But being able to apply that to our finances gives my clients a lot of breathing room because they may already be working in therapy with a therapist, and like these terms are very familiar to them. And so being able to apply that to their finances, it builds a bridge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because money again impacts all aspects of our life, but we're so trained to think of it as just spreadsheets and numbers and cold hard things that building that emotional connection is a little bit difficult. And so the trauma money approach allows me to teach my clients how to get a little bit more emotional resiliency with their finances.
Especially if people's financial situations change so much. When you, perhaps as the kid of an immigrant, grow up and it's always paycheck to paycheck. Money is in exchange for the time that is spent working and the exact amount of time in labor, versus then when you start working and it's a salaried job, that's probably so confusing because you're like, oh, wait, I have not had to physically like break my back to get this money. Yeah. How am I supposed to wrap my head around having it and spending it or saving it? So, what are some other ways that growing up in an immigrant household could impact somebody's relationship with money?
I think the biggest one is coming back to the idea of the collectivist community mindset. And so growing up in a collectivist culture, that typically means that we value the many over the one. And so this can relate to our finances in the fact that, yeah, of supporting multi-generations, so our parents in retirement, sharing your wealth with other people, but also this idea of, you need to kind of put on a front or some sort of representation that you're okay financially because you don't want other people to think you're doing poorly. The what will other people think statement,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which a lot of especially in the South Asian community, that's a very big sentiment. And so that could lead to things like, overspending on big things, living a lavish lifestyle, saying yes to going out, um, overspending on gifts, all these things to show that you have material wealth when behind closed doors that you may be struggling. And it's because we grew up in a culture most of the time that money was a very taboo topic to talk about, right? It kind of happened behind closed doors. There wasn't really anything like a healthy conversation about money. And on the sort of public side, your parents would be behind closed doors telling you, no, we can't afford that, we can't get these things. But if there's a wedding or if there's a birthday, all of a sudden there's money that we can, give to other people. And that can be very confusing. So I think what I've seen a lot with my clients is this idea of what will other people think, and that fear of, well, I need to present myself a certain way. Otherwise, what will the community think of me?
Something else when it comes to growing up in an immigrant household, in particular, how do gender roles impact relationship with money?
Yeah, this is a big one. I think, to be fair, I'll talk about maybe the male's perspective first. Typically in South Asian culture and other collectivist cultures, the sons in the family do typically take on that role of the caregiver and, the retirement savior, all these things. And so that does exist. Like, the males can step up and that they do have that role. As a woman or as a daughter, however, it's a bit more confusing. What I've seen with my clients is that, there may not be an expectation for them to be like the retirement plan per se, especially if there is a brother or another male relative in their household, but there is still a claim to their money, right? So like I was saying earlier, your paycheck comes in, but it doesn't fully feel like it's yours because you pay your bills and maybe do a little bit of shopping, but then the rest of it kind of disappears on you because you're supporting your family. There is that expectation that you need to support your family. This idea of being the good daughter, being the good honorable daughter, typically means that you self-sacrifice for other people. And so that still kind of gets reflected with our finances as well. And so if you say no, if you're like, no, I can't help you with this or whatever it may be, you risk facing emotional backlash. And that can be very difficult. And what I see a lot is that there's a bit of this disconnect between traditional personal finance and like finance related to being a daughter of immigrants, because we're kind of just told like, hey, just look after yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't, if you're struggling financially, why are you helping your parents? Like, why are you helping your siblings? Like, just look after yourself. Just say no. But it's like, we can't say no, right? And I think that's really hard for people to grasp when they aren't in the culture, when they aren't in the community like that, to be like, well, why can't you say no? And so that leads to that struggle, that internal battle of, okay, do I look after myself here as, the daughter, or do I risk being the black sheep of the family and saying no?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really rooted in that cultural conflict between balancing the two cultures of being in North America and still being raised with the values from your other culture, and then the other element of what people will think if you say yes or you say no to your family. I know you had mentioned earlier that you weren't seeing money mentors who looked like you when you were growing up, and you were doing all of your own self-education in money. And of course, this leads to a lot of gaps in terms of how people of color, women of color, immigrants can support themselves and learn about money. Was there, I don't know, a moment when you were taking in all of this information, seeing all these people, where you thought, these people don't understand me and they don't understand my experience?
Yeah, it was when I walked into a bank branch and
Oh,
I
God.
spoke to
The
somebody.
most stressful thing ever.
Yeah, I was speaking to a financial advisor at that time. I was like early 20s. I wanted to start investing, and so I kind of just went and had that conversation with them. And so he was just kind of asking me general questions of like where my paycheck typically goes. And I mentioned that, yeah, like a portion of it goes to like supporting my family. He did see like a large transfer. I think it was about $1,200 that went out of my account. He was like, oh, like what was that for? And I was like, oh, like a family member in Toronto needed support. And so I just like, I e-transferred them like some money. And he was shocked.
Mm-hmm.
He was just like, oh, okay. And I just kind of felt really uncomfortable in that conversation because it felt like there just wasn't a place of understanding coming from him, and also a little bit of judgment. And that's when I started to feel like, okay, like you just don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just here to get some like financial advice, but then I started to see that disconnect between what traditional finance tells you to do and maybe more of a balanced approach that kind of takes into my role as a daughter of immigrants, as a daughter, and my own financial goals. So I think that's the moment that defined that for me.
Yeah. It's so funny to me because when you tell that story, I think, oh, yeah, of course, you would help out your family member. Isn't that just something that you would do? Of course, within reason, because you're not going to put yourself in a position to be taken advantage of. I remember, so as everyone knows, I won Survivor, came into a lot of money. And when I was doing press after the show, the common question I would get was, what are you going to do with the money? And I would always say, okay, well, first I want to make sure my parents have whatever they need. Fast forward, my parents were like, we don't want any of your money. You want it. You take care of yourself. So thank you, parents. But then the way that so many people who were interviewing me, or so many people read the interviews, thought, they were like, wow, you're such a nice girl for thinking of your parents. And for me, I'm like, oh, like, wouldn't we all do that? Like, I feel like perhaps that's a result of being ingrained in that culture. So I guess it can go both ways, where I'm just like, oh wow, we really have such different views when it comes to money.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And when did you make the connection between the emotional side of it and then being able to apply the more functional tools when it comes to money?
So for myself, or for like my clients and my work?
Just for yourself, and then realizing that that's an opportunity for your clients.
For sure. I think for me, the disconnect started to come to fruition when I was saving money and I was in a better position financially, and I still felt like I was struggling. And I still felt like it wasn't enough. And then that's where I had to take a step back and be like, well, what's going on here? Like, I'm earning a paycheck, I'm saving more than my parents probably ever did, right? My bank account looks secure, but I don't feel like it's enough. I think I'm still chasing, and I feel like I'm still, scared that like something could happen. And that's when the thoughts start to come in of like, oh, okay, I'm being triggered, right? I am forecasting the future that something could go wrong and I won't be prepared. And look at that, a disaster happens. I'm going to repeat what happened when I was 16. And so that's when I started to recognize the role of trauma. And a lot of that honestly came to fruition when I was in the trauma money program, because I wasn't aware before, right? Like, I wasn't aware of these connections, how these thought processes can connect between when I was a teenager and where I was today. And this idea that there's just a little bit more going on with my finances than just building a bigger bank account, because I could keep doing that, but if I emotionally didn't feel safe and secure with that, there was still a disconnect.
Oh, completely. And I think that growing up as someone in an immigrant household, and I've talked to other friends who have grown up in similar ways, there's also this scarcity mindset when it comes to money, where you just feel like you need to keep earning it and almost like hoarding it and putting it into your account, and then you don't want to spend it either. Yes. So like, what does that look like? And is that something that you see with your clients too?
Yes, for sure. And so a concept that I learned is actually in a book. The name is escaping me now, but hopefully it comes to me. But they talked about scarcity, and this idea of perceived scarcity and actual scarcity. And that was what really kind of like put everything together for me. And so for many of us, we grew up in environments where, again, money was a struggle, money was scarce. We didn't really get everything that we wanted, and we kind of compared ourselves to other kids. And so again, there was the idea of like money is lacking. As an adulthood, you get your own paycheck, right? Maybe you are able to buy yourself your own things now, right? But there's still that underlying fear of like, well, this could all kind of go away on me. And so actual scarcity is living, low income, unable to put food on the table, not having like secure housing, all these things. That is actual scarcity. Perceived scarcity is this idea that there isn't enough of a resource for me in the world. So money, there isn't enough. It's a feeling of like there isn't enough money in the world for me, but it's different from actual scarcity. However, our brain reacts as if we are living in actual scarcity, that maybe we are living in poverty, that we are, we're living without having, that security. And so then that triggers us to then hoard our money. Maybe on the other side, we overspend it because we're like, well, if it's going to disappear on me, I might as well control how it disappears on me, and I'll just buy whatever I want for myself. And so I really help my clients kind of understand that concept. It's difficult to grasp, but like the idea between actual scarcity and perceived scarcity, and kind of taking a step back anytime they feel triggered with their money, that reminds them maybe as a child when they couldn't get something or money felt unsafe. And that then leads to them maybe wanting to take a trauma response to their money, which is usually overspending or the frugality route.
I can totally relate to that. And I think that this will sound crazy when I share this example with all the listeners, but I remember after I won Survivor and I came into all of this money, people are probably thinking, okay, she's going to be living large. But I remember I was like, okay, I have to find a good financial planner. So interviewed with a bunch of financial planners, found somebody made sure that the majority of the money was in investments, made sure I had a plan for the money. And then I was like, okay, like, am I allowed to like use it now? And it took me a while for me to actually decide, oh, I'm going to purchase something. And this purchase is just because I like it. It's not like an investment in the future. It's not because it's supposed to make this easier or whatever. It's like, it took me months before I could buy myself one thing. I'm like, this is just a present to myself for this big achievement. So I feel like even though, yes, I came into more money than I had ever seen before in my life, I still felt that scarcity mindset. So it really does like continue to penetrate your life like way after your financial situation changes from when you're a kid.
Yeah, and another thing I'll mention there too, just to kind of piggyback off that a little bit, is there's a money disorder called the vow of poverty. And what this means is basically when you're someone that grew up in an environment where money was scarce and hard to kind of come by and you can't really spend it on things that you wanted, as an adult, it feels really strange and weird for you to be able to do those things. So in a way, you sort of self-sabotage to kind of bring yourself back to living how you were living as you were growing up. And so that when I heard that concept too, I'm like, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because we hear about NFL players or any people that come into a large amount of wealth and then they lose it, right? It goes away on them. And there is this other aspect of, being uncomfortable with a certain amount of money or having access to more money than you ever had before.
Oh, yeah, I can completely relate. And I think especially like I can relate to those NFL players who come into money. Not that I've broken my back to become an NFL player or done any of that stuff by any means, but yeah, when you all of a sudden come into this lump sum, I think for me also my work situation changed after I was on the show, where I went from being a salaried employee to now working on a freelance basis, which, as many people know, is feast or famine.
Mm-hmm.
And on those famine times, I'm just like, oh my God, am I going to be okay? And I'm like, no, I have to remember, like, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm literally fine. But again, that's like a weird trauma response, which I'm working on. I'm in therapy. We're good people. So when people want to start identifying these money stories for themselves, what are questions that someone like you could start asking them, or that they can start asking themselves?
Yeah, my favorite is journaling about a painful or confusing money memory. And this could be one, it could be multiple, but really starting to get put on paper some of these memories that maybe you've forgotten about, or maybe you didn't think were a big deal as relates to your money, and just bringing that to the forefront. My next question is typically around how your caregivers responded with money or acted with money. So if your mom, how did she react about her finances, and her dad? And that also gives us another layer of insight. So with some of my clients, I'll see, oh, my mom, she saved everything and she was actually in control of money. My dad, he spent it on whatever he wanted and there was always chaos, and they fought about that. And so even between just those two statements, we can start to see with my client, okay, behaviorally, it makes sense why you might be someone who avoids their money, right? Or why you overspend because you are acting like your dad, even though you weren't planning to, but it's a behavior that you inherited. And so again, just some of these questions to start to bring up the dots of like your behaviors versus what you grew up in, and sort of like your lived experience with that.
For some reason, everything goes back to childhood, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, it does. It does.
And it also shows that nobody grows up with a perfect view of money. I don't think there's any household where it's going to be like perfect, stress-free. We all have a healthy relationship with money. It's just we have to figure out how we grew up with money and then how we've responded to it and figure out what works for us.
Exactly. Yeah. But then that starts with, again, bringing that awareness, right? And starting to think of money not just as, again, like it's a cold spreadsheet thing, but it's a relationship, right? And so being able to delve into that relationship in a safe space, right, is really important.
So, what are potential healthy relationships that people could strive for when it comes to their relationship with money?
Number one is not being afraid to look at your bank or credit card statements, which even as I say that, a lot of people are like, oh, that's a hard one, right? Because with that, again, there's a lot of fear within that action of like, oh, I'm going to see how much I spent, or I've been trying to avoid like that accountability, or bank account's not showing me the number that I want. So I'm just like not going to look at that and just kind of go with the flow. And so really being able to practice being able to log into that bank account and react with this from a space of neutrality is really important, because the first step when it comes to your finance is being able to take inventory and just know where you're at, right? What are your numbers? What's coming in? What's leaving? Where are you spending your money, right? And those are questions that can be very overwhelming and triggering for people when they're starting to start their financial journey, because they've been avoiding it for so long, or they associate, like I said, fear and anxiety with that moment. So you want to be able to look at your bank statements and credit statements with neutrality. But if all those moments seem a little too big right now, a strategy I recommend is actually building an exposure pyramid for your money. And so an exposure pyramid is basically a list of actions. There's the base of your pyramid, and then it kind of keeps going up and up. The base of your pyramid is going to be a few small actions that are just miniature in nature, right? It could be like you spent money, looked at your bank, you look at your banking app, and you just kind of see that money deducted, right? A small action like that. It could be finding out when your bills are due in the month and putting that on a calendar, right? So all these small actions, and then you build your exposure pyramid to then kind of get you to the top of like the more exposure items, which could be looking at your bank statement, building a budget, right? Any of these things. But starting with just small minuscule steps just to kind of build that relationship of, hey, money is safe for me to engage with. I don't have to be afraid of it, is really helpful.
And then the top of the pyramid, that looks different for everybody depending on their goals.
Absolutely. And again, your exposure pyramid will look different from the next person as well.
So what are some actions that might be a result of things like feeling shameful or feeling guilty about money that you think could be a bit easier to address as a place to get started?
Ooh. I think the first one is not being ashamed of spending. And so what I see a lot is people hide or like lie, or they don't want to hold themselves accountable to what they've been spending. And I think we're starting to redefine that relationship a little bit, because I want people to enjoy their money. We want you to be able to enjoy your money, buy yourself things without feeling that guilt. And so if you're feeling that guilt, I would ask, okay, where is that stemming from? Right. And usually it's a result of, well, I'm not really paying attention to my finances overall. And so I don't know if I can actually afford to buy that thing or not, right? And so starting from a place of just, again, taking that inventory, knowing what's kind of coming in, what's going out is really helpful. But a tip that I always recommend to my clients is separating your spending money into a separate checkings account and labeling it like guilt-free spending or spending money. It could be a separate checkings account. It could be a prepaid Visa card, anything that's kind of separated from your main checkings account. Because I want you to be able to spend from that card, see the money being deducted, right? And have a boundary with your spending and not being questioning, okay, can I afford that thing? Yes or no? Hey, did I pay my bills this month? Like, do I need that money? We kind of separate that for you. And so that's a really big tool or tip that I help my clients implement, is separating their spending money.
That's so smart. And it also goes to show that people's relationships with money are so different. Because when I think back to Till Death Do Us Part, the show that we watched growing up, probably for somebody who has a lot of guilt around spending money, if someone was to hand them an envelope and say, this is only the amount of money you can spend this month, that would probably be like a relief to them and wouldn't be scary to them at all. Because it's like, great, I have to limit myself to this.
Yes. It provides that boundary. And then I think the other aspect too is that for some people, they can be given that envelope and then be like, oh, this is it. Oh, I'm not used to that, right? Mm-hmm. And there's also that adjustment and that fear there too. But it's all about, again, taking inventory and just starting to take small steps and feeling like you are in control of your finances. And a big part of that is being in control of your spending.
Mm-hmm. Completely. Yeah, it's so interesting how it really is all tied down to the emotion, right? Because the money symbolizes something different for everybody.
Yes.
So even identifying what that is for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then what about for things that might not be as common when you were growing up in an immigrant household? So what I'm thinking about is investing, because growing up in a household like that, it was very much you work per hour, you earn money, you hold on to it, or all of the money needs to be spent for the day-to-day or living expenses that week. So it's really hard. At least like when I was growing up, it was really hard to see examples of being able to like invest and grow your wealth. And it was a concept that for me in my early 20s, it took me a while to wrap my head around. So for somebody who perhaps grew up in an immigrant household, how do they wrap their head around something like that?
Yeah, I think goes back to the idea of, money just being a tool for survival for most of us growing up and not necessarily a wealth building tool. And so again, just that narrative representation also having to shift, right? Like, hey, it doesn't have to be just for bills and like my food, like I actually have money left over, and hey, look, I can actually grow my wealth through like the realm of investing. Another disconnect though, that I see is that a lot of my clients hesitate with this idea of like their money working for them instead of them working for their money. Because what investing does is that it takes the legwork off of you and it grows your money over time, so you don't have to save as much money over time, right? That's what the stock market does. But again, growing up in an immigrant household, that's a bit of a disconnect because it's like, well, anything I earn, I usually have to work for. So when it comes to getting your head around this, number one, I want to make sure that you're in a position to invest. And that typically looks like having no high interest debts, like a credit card or anything like that. And having, a 3 to 6 month emergency fund, which is your bare necessity expenses put aside into a savings account. And then I would also suggest other savings account for things like travel or like a car fund, like anything else that may come up that could leave you vulnerable. Because when it comes to investing, we don't want your money to be tied up in the stock market when you might actually need it for your day-to-day life. So we really need to separate that. Then I would say start to educate yourself. This could be with books. It could be with YouTube. I wouldn't really recommend TikTok or Instagram because there are a lot of like finance bros and crypto stuff out there and like, oh, just like buy this one stock and you'll be rich. Like that's not it. Like pick up the books, look up accredited people and start to follow and just educate yourself about the realm of investing because it is super overwhelming. You won't be able to do it in a month. You'll have to take a few months, maybe even a year to kind of get comfortable with the idea of knowing what to do.
That's good advice too, because I think if you're someone who grew up in a household where money has anxiety around it or you don't talk about money, oh my God, like going and looking something up is probably overwhelming. And I could see why people would just want to go to the bank and be like, okay, just tell me what to put my money in and then that's fine.
Yeah. But when we do that, unfortunately, then we're kind of at the mercy of what the banks tell us to do. And sometimes, again, their investing portfolios aren't the best for us, right? They're typically higher fees or something called a management expense ratio, MER. And so typically that's usually 2%, and that can eat into your returns over time. Whereas self-directed investing or investing through a robo-advisor, and if I'm saying these terms and you're like, what are these things? Great time to Google, take a look. Those are sort of better solutions, I would say, for younger people and millennials because our parents didn't have access to those, 10, 20 years ago, but we do. And so if you're listening to this podcast, I would recommend 2 robo-advisors. One is Questrade and their Quest Wealth portfolios and Wealthsimple. Wealthsimple is probably the biggest one, and some of you may have already heard about it, but they also have a really robust just like FAQ section and education platform. And so that could also be a good place for you to start just taking a look and seeing what they have to offer.
Yes, there's so many more options now in terms of our money. So once we address our money fears, the sky's the limit for us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So if people want to get started, let's say today, in terms of addressing some of their money concerns, I know you mentioned journaling about painful money experiences. What is something else that somebody could do?
It's going to go back to taking inventory. And so what I typically have my clients do is conduct a financial audit. And again, if this is too much of a heavy first step for you, again, build your exposure pyramid list of those other small action items. But the next step would be to download your past 3 months of bank credit card statements and just starting to kind of look through your spending and categorize. Add up the eating out, add up the Amazon, add up like where your money's been going. Because we want to just know that the answer to that question, like where has your money been going, right? Because once we know that, we can then find action items and areas to reduce to free up money to put towards things like your savings goals or your debt repayment. So take that inventory, do that financial audit, find a couple of categories that you want to be intentional about reducing, whether it's eating out or like the Amazon or whatever it may be, and then set up an automatic contribution of like that amount towards your savings goals or towards your debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important for people to know that you shouldn't feel guilty about every item that you've spent money on. And it really is contextual for each person, whether or not that expense is a high value. Like something that I saw that you had written was you're not going to judge somebody for their expensive gym membership, because if that gym membership is adding to their life and adding value and they can afford it, then go for it.
Exactly. And so I think that's another great point too, which is identifying those valuable areas of spending for yourself. Like maybe you are someone that like works a lot and doesn't really have time to meal prep, or the idea of cooking doesn't make any sense for you, right? So maybe you do rely heavily on a meal prep service or a delivery or going out. That's fine. I'd rather you do that than sort of double dipping, which means you go and buy groceries that you don't end up using and you order takeout, and all of a sudden like you spent double the amount that you had to. So again, understanding your lifestyle, understanding what works best for you, but also identifying areas of wastage. Not every purchase is going to be a good purchase, right? And so being able to reflect on that too, to be like, hey, you know what? Like, what was that $300 I spent on Amazon last month? Can you remember anything? Is there only one item that comes to mind? That's interesting, right? How come we can't remember the rest of them, right? Maybe they weren't high value purchases. So a lot of reflection that can come out of that too.
Yeah, it's so dependent on each person. Actually, a real story, well, just like a silly anecdote of mine. It was years ago. So this was before I was even on Survivor. I remember I was working with a financial planner and she was like, okay, make a list with your monthly expenses and separate the needs versus the wants. So she's looking at them. She's like, oh, things like dyeing your hair and getting your nails done don't count as needs. And I'm like, no, but for me, like those are fixed monthly expenses and they're important to me and I must have them and I will compromise on other things. She's like, okay. She's like, if that's what you want and that's important to you. And I'm like, yeah. So yeah, those are my fixed expenses according to my financial planner.
Yeah, I love that. And then that one thing I have my clients do is similar to that is identify their top 3 non-negotiable expenses for the month, right? So for some of them, it's like their nails, it's their laser, it's like going out to brunch with their friends or whatever it may be. Like identifying some top 3 categories, because again, it's like, okay, these are things that we absolutely want, like for you to be spending money on each month. We know they provide you high value, right? So we don't have to eliminate them.
That's the thing. It's different for everybody. So yeah, everyone keep brunching within reason if you can.
Yeah.
Well, Parween, I feel like I got so much out of this conversation. And I think for so many people, it'll open their eyes to perhaps their own money stories. If people want to keep up with you or learn more about the work that you do, where can they find you?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram at parween.mander, and then my website, www.thewealthywolf, with the E at the end of wolf.ca. And usually on my links in bio, I have my free ebook, The Brown Girl's Guide to Building Generational Wealth, which is 26 pages long, chock full information. So that could be a resource that your audience can start with.
Thank you so much for being here today. And everybody listening, let's all get rich.
Yeah, let's all build wealth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whenever I hear from Parween, I always get inspired to go back and reevaluate my own money story. And I hope that this can serve as inspiration for anybody else listening. So thank you so much, Parween, for being on the show. Now, on a lighter note, I love to answer a listener question at the end of each episode. And this week's question was just so chill and fun and so seasonally appropriate. So this week's question is, what is your favorite Christmas song? And I love this. I mean, I grew up Catholic. I don't really practice Catholicism anymore, but I grew up Catholic, so Christmas was always a big part of the year. So my all-time favorite Christmas song, which I think is severely underrated, and it needs to get more play and really be up there in the top echelon of iconic Christmas songs, is My Only Wish This Year by Britney Spears. I had to check because I always think it's called Santa, Can You Hear Me? But it is in fact called My Only Wish This Year. And I just think Britney slays, pun intended. And this song, severely underrated. I will die on the hill of saying this is one of the best Christmas pop songs ever. And if you are in a Christmassy mood, let's all help Britney out and make sure that we are putting this on our Christmas playlists. Some honorable mentions. So some Christmas music that's new. I really enjoy the Sabrina Carpenter Christmas album that just came out. I love the Christmas remix of Nonsense. And honestly, I'm not like a huge Sabrina Carpenter fan per se, just because I don't listen to a ton of her music, but I really appreciate this niche she has built out for herself in the pop landscape. And yeah, all of her endings to her songs every time she's touring, her on the Eras tour. So I have respect for how Sabrina Carpenter has built her career over the last few years. I also just love talking about pop stars and pop culture. So let me know if you want to hear me talk about that more with a guest on the show. And the honorable mention I always need to have, the holiday versions of BTS's Dynamite and Butter. So if you want to hear their English songs, except with more bells, perfect. Holiday, I love it. That is always on the playlist. I admittedly listen to these versions even when it's not the holidays. So that was such a cute and fun question. Thank you so much for that. If you have any questions for me, whether they are cute, like what's my favorite Christmas song, or you want advice, or you want to hear something really like deep and introspective about me, let me know in the comments and hopefully I can answer it in a future episode. Until then, I want to say thank you so much for tuning in. As always, you can subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We're on Instagram and on YouTube. It's at Happy to See Me Pod. I am always so grateful when you spend time with me, and I will be happy to see you next Monday.